Well, it is good to have you back for another day as we are continuing on through our study. My name is Kevin Young, and I have the privilege of serving here at Christ Table as lead clergy. Now, if you'd like to know more about Christ Table, you can visit that URL that is right up there, www.christstable.today. I want to encourage you whenever you get there to sign up for our email list there and consider, if you find these Bible studies helpful, making a donation here to Christ Table. And good to see folks signing on over here. I get the comment feed live whenever it comes up, and I love that, even though I'm a couple of minutes late today. So thanks for hanging in there. Now, if you'd like to get the resources in print that are a part of this study, or the free version of those on PDF, you can go to that URL at the bottom of your screen, go.christstable.today/outsiders, and there you can download this PDF of the book. You can also get the box that has that in it there. Also in that box are lots of other things, as well as this study, which is super cool, written by Chris, for youth and for adolescents, and all that information is there at the URL at the bottom of your screen. Now, we are walking through this study of outsiders, and what we're doing is we're taking 6 weeks to look at 24 people who in the Bible are outside of the religious community, the worshiping community, who don't feel a part of what's going on in the context in which they have been placed in. Now, most of those 24 individuals end up having a very positive impact in some way, and in so doing, teaching us a lesson. But there are a few people, we had one of those last week, who are cautionary tales, who still teaches a lesson, but teaches a lesson perhaps of what not to do rather than what to do. So today we find ourselves back with Jesus again, as we were in day 4, although at this point we're going to look at Jesus at the very beginning of his ministry time. And one of the things that you kind of recognize whenever you begin to kind of put together and understand the timelines of scriptures, the trajectory of the 3.5 years or so of time that Jesus spent in ministry, saw a lot of changes in kind of the way that he interacted with individuals, the way other individuals interacted with him. And as he began to move forward through his ministry, he became something of an outsider more and more. The more well-known he became, and the more well-known what he thought was understood. Well, one of the things that I find is interesting, and you see this in this passage in Luke chapter 5, and actually I'll just put that text back up there again, because if you kind of want to read around this, we see in this Luke chapter 5 passage, Jesus calling the disciples. You're going to see him call Levi right after this passage. Before this, you're going to see him call, I think it's, if I'm right, Peter and Andrew. And what we see here, kind of sandwiched in between him, kind of picking and choosing who's going to be a part of his small tribe, the 12, we actually see him do a couple of miracles in here. And we also, in the very beginning, even before all of the 12 are pulled together, we see pushback starting. And so Jesus, as far as we know, wasn't a known quantity and had done literally nothing that we know of, and people are still kind of pushing him to the outside. So you may find that in your context, that many of the reasons and places in which you are an outsider, even in religious communities, may have nothing to do with anything that you have said or anything that you have done. One of the main reasons was because he was a redneck from the area of Galilee called Nazareth. He didn't have a great family line that anyone knew of. He didn't grow up in a religious system like in Jerusalem. And so sometimes you're just an outsider because other people decide you're an outsider through no fault of your own. So Luke chapter 5, Jesus is in the midst of calling his disciples, and he happens upon this guy in one of the villages who has an advanced case of leprosy. Now, leprosy in those days, and I say this oftentimes whenever we get to these passages that have leprosy listed. Leprosy was kind of this umbrella term for skin conditions that caused either lesions or flaking or boils or rashes. Um, and so there are many things, many medical conditions of the skin that would have been categorized under leprosy. Psoriasis, which I have, an autoimmune disease, would have been categorized under this. I would have been forced to be a part of a leper colony if I had been in first century Israel during the time of Jesus, because they didn't have the medical know-how to separate out uh, all of these different diseases, and which ones were communicable, which ones were not communicable. Nobody wanted to find out by receiving the disease whether or not this was one of those or one of the others. And so if you had anything that even smacked of being a part of something that was like leprosy, you were ostracized. Um, you had to leave your family, you had to leave your community. Oftentimes that meant going and living outside of cities. You had to, if you were ever in distant contact with someone, and by contact I mean within, like, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet of someone, you see someone on the horizon coming around, you have to start shouting unclean, unclean, so that they don't get too close to you unaware. And so everyone who you had known, everyone whom you had loved, abandoned you. No physical touch. No one to be there for you. People forgot about you. To most people, even your loved ones, you ended up being dead to them, because the thought of you being alive but not able to have contact was just too painful. And so Jesus meets one of these lepers who has an advanced case of leprosy, which means there was a look, it was all over him. There would have been a smell. It was nasty. When the man sees Jesus, he bows his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. This is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We have no idea how this guy knows that Jesus is a healer. Perhaps this story is from a little later in Jesus' ministry and that Luke shifts it around, but we'll just take it at face value and believe that, understanding that this is at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, and so perhaps Jesus has done some healings here that weren't on record in Luke. Either way, what we see here is that there is contact between Jesus and this individual. They are close enough to be able to have a conversation, close enough for the leper to be able to bow, close enough for them to be not just in proximity, but for them to be face to face. Jesus is breaking maybe a legal code here, but definitely Jesus is breaking a social code here. He's breaking a medical code here. We see this over and again with Jesus, breaking the rules in order to be with outsiders, even going so far as to break the rules that put Jesus now in danger for breaking those rules. Here, he is in danger of contracting leprosy by being in such close proximity to this individual. That is breaking the rules. It's the kind of people who were working alongside and in community with the AIDS and HIV community back before we fully understood much about it, how it was transmitted, how it was received, how communicable it was, what was dangerous, what wasn't dangerous. Many people put themselves in harm's way, being the hands and feet of Jesus. We saw this a lot of times even more recently with COVID, in the beginning especially, whenever we didn't understand it, what it was, how dangerous it was or wasn't, how it was transmitted, how easily or uneasily it was transmitted, what the long-term effects of it were. Many, many people put themselves intentionally in harm's way in order to help those who were outsiders. Medically, but still outsiders. We see Jesus doing this, not just in the spiritual realm, but also here in the medical realm. We see Jesus also doing it in the relational realm as well. Jesus is always leaving those who are on the inside in order to stand in solidarity to help those who are on the outside. If you are an outsider, I think it's more likely than not that Jesus is standing with you rather than with the community that's on the inside, especially if there is a reason why you have been pushed to the outside by those who are on the inside. I can almost assure you that Jesus is on the outside with you, breaking the rules to be there. So Jesus reaches out, and I want you to imagine this, knowing and understanding a little bit more about leprosy. Jesus reaches out and touches him. This is an individual that had been ostracized and had been declared essentially and legally dead by his family, by anyone who had ever loved him, any of his neighbors and community. And so there was no intimacy, there was no touch, there was no proximity to people, let alone touch. Now, within leper colonies and among lepers, there may have been that. You may have found another leper to build community with, and that did happen. But in an advanced stage of leprosy, there would have been highly likely no contact with how he would have looked and smelled and what it would have taken. It just touch and intimacy in any way would have not been a part of his story at this time. And Jesus reaches out and touches him. I just sit for a moment with a Jesus who does that needlessly. Jesus didn't need to reach out and touch him. Jesus could have shouted a healing from a quarter mile away. But before he heals him, Jesus comes not just into proximity, but to face proximity. And before Jesus heals and fixes the problem, Jesus doesn't even come to face proximity. He comes touch to touch proximity. Think of the power of that. Jesus is about to heal an outer condition, but I think what we miss here is that there are two miracles. And the first and perhaps the greater miracle is the healing of the inner condition, the relational condition, the healing of somebody who felt as though they had been abandoned, was worthless, was undeserving of love. And in a touch, Jesus heals that. I'm willing, Jesus says, be healed, and instantly the leprosy disappeared. And then oddly, and this really goes to Jesus and the timing of his ministry and what he wanted people to know about him and his mission and when and safety and all these things, Jesus instructs him not to tell anyone what had happened, but instead, and this was a required process by law, to go to the priest and let the priest examine you, take the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy, and this will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. So there was a process to go through to officially, legally be declared as clean from this. And Jesus says, go ahead and do what you need to do so that you can return back to community. Jesus moves him from outside back to inside the community if the man wishes. So a couple of days ago, this post came up on Twitter. Picture of a church, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, with a sign, and it is Pride Month, that simply says, "This church loves you." Then an individual on Twitter posts, and I think last time I checked, it was around 5,000 likes, lots of comments, lots of retweets, lots of quote tweets of people with things to say about this. But it's simple: no, they don't. The LGBTQ community has been outsidered by the church. This church says, "Come on inside. We love you." But there are many who believe that that is not true love, but that true love is telling the person truth as the individual understands it, on the basis of their belief as to what the Bible says and teaches. Doctrine over love. The Bible over proximity. I recognize that these are difficult issues and pressures and questions to work through. But I'm reminded that whether or not we agree or disagree doctrinally with how or who somebody is, there is no question that the LGBTQ, the queer community, are outsiders from the church. Oft intentionally placed there, and other times simply by our belief systems ending up there. I believe that just like the leper colony, Jesus is oftentimes standing with the outsiders. Why? To show compassion, to validate humanity. You see, in this passage in Luke chapter 5, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we have several things going on, not just the calling of the disciples, not just the miracles, but we also have Jesus beginning to teach and to preach and to rebuff and push back the religious leaders and what they have to say about him and what he should be allowed to do and what he shouldn't be allowed to do, or, in a word, his authority. What we see happen in this passage, fascinatingly, as Luke is telling the story, is that Luke tells the story of Jesus' compassion before he tells the story of Jesus' authority. And we're going to continue to actually see this throughout Jesus' ministry and not just in the Gospel of Luke either. And this is important because it's not just the way that Luke is telling the story, but it is the way that Jesus lived his life. When we think of Jesus, one of the primary things that we think of is his ability to heal, but also maybe even more than that, that comes from our understanding of Jesus being God, authority. And yet, rather than lead and be in our face all of the time as they write the story, and even as Jesus lives out who he is and what he does, we don't see him often or regularly drawing attention to his authority or to the law, the religious law, or to the doctrines. Do we see Jesus do that in moments and locations? Yeah, we do. But it's secondary. It's secondary to the story that the gospel writers want to tell, and it's secondary seemingly to the story that Jesus lives out. For Jesus, it is always seemingly compassion before authority with those who are outside or those who are in need. We see moments where Jesus doesn't give compassion. We see moments where Jesus says, to tell you the truth is love. And when those moments are? for the insiders, for the uber religious, not for the outsiders, not for the broken, not for the sinners. For them, it is compassion always over authority and the rule and the letter of the law. What we see in Jesus is, math was never my greatest thing, but I think I understand this one. Compassion is always greater than authority. That love is always more important than whatever doctrinal truth you feel like is more important than showing someone compassion. I would say that that's sin. I would say that that's evil. I would say that that kind of mentality is antichrist. Jesus stands with the outsiders in proximity, face to face, touch to touch. That says something. Until tomorrow, happy reading.